Hi everyone, welcome to Needles, Thread and Little Betty, and today we're going to do part 3 of the Dreamy Owl quilt. If you can see behind me, I've been getting on with the blocks and putting them, displaying them out. What you can see there is, because the actual quilt is wider than the design board, I've overlapped, so it probably looks a little bit sort of I guess messy, but obviously when it's all sewn together they won't be overlapped like that. It's just because of the space, really. So if you remember from part 2, what I'd done, I'd cut out all the strips and I was sewing the strips together and then cutting the strips up into blocks, and what we ended up with were pieces like this. So what I'm going to do today is just go through the blocks with you so that they end up like they do on the board. Okay, right. So the first block I'm going to make is this, just a square one, and all it is the strips that we cut out, just sewing them together. If you can see on the design board, there are some bigger ones, but it's the same principles. Now, if I just show you this one here, that one is bigger, but it's just the same principles as the smaller blocks. Okay, and then we're going to make this one, which is just slightly different. Okay, this one's on the bias, but I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute or two. Okay, so for the first block, what we need to do is, it's made of the 4 strips. I've got the 4 strips ready, and it's just about placing them together. The same principles, 1/4 of an inch seam line, and just sewing in opposite directions. And the only thing you need to remember is to get them in the order that they need to be for the pattern, because again, if you look at the main quilt, they're all sort of, you can see these, you can start to see these diagonals of the different colours, and that's what you want to do, is just make sure it's all in the same pattern. Okay, so for this one, for the first block, these go in pink at the top, the next one is the grey at the top, and then we've got this kind of swirly purple, and finishing with this kind of like honeycomb type purples and reds in the middle. And that's all we're doing, is basically just putting these blocks, these strips together into the block. Okay, I'll just bring you over to the machine. I'm not going to go through all the sewing tips and that for putting the blocks together. It's exactly the same as when we did the strips. Okay. So all the way to the end. What you want to remember is, when you are sewing these strips together, which are made up of little blocks, is just be mindful of the seams that are folded at the back, because what you don't want to do is, if your machine's sewing over them, is to pull it one way when it should be going the other way. It just makes it a little bit more bulky at the back if they're kind of like sewed against the way they're folded. Okay, so same principles with the next one, just doing the same thing, just the opposite way. I'll just put that one together. What you might find as well is where you've got the creases from each of the blocks that are sewn together, where you've got like the seam lines going across, sometimes they kind of pull together. And so when you're sewing these strips together, just ensure that the seam lines that are going across, these ones that are going across, they line up next to each other, because otherwise it's just going to be sort of a bit like brickwork where they're not in line. Okay. If you find that that's happening, that the kind of not quite matching up when it's just like a mill, just give it a little bit of a, just give it a little tiny bit of a stretch. I mean, you don't want to be stretching it a lot or anything, but fabric's very forgiving, so just give it a tiny bit of a stretch just so it matches up. If it's a long way out, then something's wrong and you probably need to just take that out, have a look, see what's going wrong, and do that part again. I mean, you're never going to get it 100% perfect. Well, you might do, but I never have. So what the best thing is to do is don't start stressing or worrying about it. Just line it up the best you can. And unless you're going in for some competition or something, no one's going to be picking your quilt up and saying, oh, this one's a millimetre out, doesn't quite line up. So the last one for this block. All the way along. Ensuring that your seams are, the folds of your seams are facing the right way. And there you've got your block. Now, once you've completed your blocks, and I've completed most of mine. I've just saved the last two of the main ones just for demonstration. But what I do is just pile them up and then give them all a good press. And again, I use a bit of starch spray. It just helps stiffen it out. If the fabric's a little bit stiffer, it's a little bit easier to work with, especially if you're doing something on the bias, which I'll come to in a minute. So all that's left to do with these blocks is to iron them both sides to get your seams. I have them going the same way. And then once you've done your block, whatever block it is, because these blocks are a specific size, these are 8.5 by 8.5. What we need to do then is just trim it up to make sure it's kind of 8.5 and 8.5. Sometimes you may find it's just slightly under here and there. That's all to do with the sewing them together. That's fine as long as it's not a big piece out. Like I say, material's forgiving. You can get round that. I know when I first started making quilts, I used to get so bogged down really with trying to get it the perfect square afterwards. And then when you make the whole thing up, you sew all the blocks together, you can't even notice. So if it's just a slightly bit out, then don't worry about that too much. Okay. So I'll just put that to one side, ready for ironing. And then we'll come to the other block, which is this one. So part of the pattern that was cut out were large blocks, but cut in half to make triangles. And because they're cut in half, this is on the bias, so that's slightly stretchy. It's not stretch fabric, but it's just because of the bias stretches slightly. So what I do, if I've got a triangle like that, before I use it, I always give that a good press and a good starch as well, because that helps to keep that stiff. What we don't want to be doing is stretching that line out. Okay. So the rest of it is part of the cutting out was making some smaller blocks. So I'm just going to put them out in order. And then there were some small triangles. Again, the same thing, just give them a bit of a press and a bit of a starch. That's what I do anyway. It's up to you, because we've got these triangles to sew on. So if you look at this here, what I've done is I've gone through I've sewn them these parts together. We're just concentrating on this part first, is sewing these little squares together to make each row. Okay. I won't go through the whole of the row now. I don't think. Let's just have a look. So for the first one, because the first part of the row is those two together, we're just starting off with those two blocks together, just making sure that your triangle is facing the right way. Because what we want it to do is when all the blocks are together, these have to sit along that triangle to make the square. Hope this is all making sense. I say that a lot, don't I? I hope this is making sense. That's because in my head it does. It's explaining it to everybody else. Okay. So I'm just going to sew those two together. Same principles, 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And the next one, which is one of the greys. I wouldn't worry too much about doing these ones in opposite ways because they're so small. It's not going to make a lot. If it was a really long piece, then I would, because you're going to notice if there's a curve then. That's all patchwork is really. It's just block by block, piecing together. And when you piece it together in your design way, that's when you end up with a finished picture. So it's like a jigsaw puzzle. If you just pick up the odd jigsaw piece, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's only when you put it all together you get a lovely picture at the end, or design. So there's the first one, the first row. So the second row in the same way, but obviously there it's a smaller row. So we just piecing these together. I guess the important thing is to just make sure you do this in the right order of the fabrics, because otherwise you're not going to end up with that pattern. Obviously, once the whole quilt's finished, you'll get to see, because you can't really, on the design board, you can't really see what it looks like properly because it's the design board's smaller than what the quilt is. That's the second block. The third block is just the two pieces. That's the two pieces, and then the final one is just one triangle on its own. So what I would do next, or what I will be doing next when I'm putting this block together, is I'll iron all of those strips first. Small ones you can finger press, but I'll just be ironing them. And then it's about putting them together. Okay, once they've all been put together, it'll look like, just fold that back, it'll look like your triangle like that. And then you use that triangle and this triangle and then sew those together, same principles, your 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then you end up with your square, again an 8.5 by 8.5 square. And to make sure you've got your 8.5 and 8.5 squares is just use, I've been using that ruler, if you can remember from part 1 and part 2. I just use that and square them up. Okay, and that's when you end up with all your blocks made. Now with this quilt, this is, although it looks like there's lots of little blocks in there, there's lots of little squares making bigger blocks, which there is. So a little bit time consuming, but it's simple, it's easy. You've just seen how quickly I've just put that one together. So it's simple. And a lot of the pattern for this is just using panels. I mean, let's take this one off. Take the pin out. So you've got panels like that. They're just squares, and you're just adding squares in. So that's one block. So it's quite an easy. I mean, you can make a beautiful looking quilt very simply. It doesn't have to be all this complex. You see all these stars and stripes and all of that. And they, don't get me wrong, they do look lovely. But you can make a beautiful quilt without having to do all of that. And I think the most complicated, I mean, this block would be the most complicated, but even that in itself, you're doing this again in the same principles. The only difference is you're sewing triangles together, and just be wary of the bias, that's all, and not stretching it. So the next thing to do is, I'll just move you up a little bit. There we go. Still getting used to this. So I'll just pop this one back on here. So the next thing to do is to start sewing the blocks together. So we're going to start with the top, and you can't see all of the blocks, can you, or can't you? There's something under there. If you can't see all of the blocks, it's because I've pinned them over the top. But you start with the top and you just sew each row. Okay, so I'm going to sew all the top row together, then row 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. And so you sew all of those to make a row. And then once you've done that, you sew all the rows together, okay? And the same as you've done that, really, it's just each block to make a row, then all the rows together, okay? And then what we'll do then is we'll come back to part 4, is once all the top part of the quilt's done, all sewn together, I will then look at making a quilt sandwich, which is the layers of the top part of the quilt, which is this. Then you've got a layer of wadding, whatever wadding you're going to be using, and then you have a backing fabric, okay? So, and then once you've done all of that, it will be about binding the quilt, quilting it first, sorry, then binding the quilt. The binding is the last part of the quilt. When you're on your binding, you know you're you're almost finished, you're on your home run then. Okay, so I'm going to start and continue with that, and then I'll come back to you in a couple of weeks' time with part 4 of the Dreamy Owl quilt. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you see and you want to stay tuned in for part 4, think about subscribing, think about pressing the alert button. That just lets you know when new videos are coming up. Give me a thumbs up if you like it. Any comments are welcomed. I'll try and answer them as soon as I can. If you're in the middle of making your own quilt, you know, send me a picture of what you're doing or tell me about it. If there's anything you want to ask me any questions. If you've got any great tips, share your tips. Okay. So that's all for now, and I'll see you for part 4 soon. Take care. Bye-bye.